Don't cry, Grandpa. Don't cry. He cried every year on Remembrance Sunday. He told us stories of why he cried. I joined the Territorial Army on my 17th birthday in January 1914 because the advert said I'd learn to ride and be with the horses every weekend. I loved horses. I used to save my pocket money so I could pay to borrow a horse from a cab company in Leeds and ride it round the park. I tried to get them to jump, but these were horses for pulling hansom cabs, not for galloping. I was mobilised with all the Territorials on the day war was declared. As I said my goodbyes, I felt my mother's arms tighten around me. It would be the last time she'd hug her little boy, the last time she'd see him for 5 years. 5 years that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The man who returned would be very different from the naive, enthusiastic, smartly dressed boy who left that day in August 1914. Throughout the war, I could feel her embrace when I closed my eyes, even during the worst of times. Soon after mobilisation, I was given my horse, Timbuck. He was a horse of spirit, feisty and fast. We were together until the last week of my homecoming 5 years later. The war took me to Gallipoli, to Egypt, to Libya, Mesopotamia, Palestine. I served with Lawrence of Arabia. And finally, after the capture of Jerusalem, we were dispatched to the Western Front and we sailed to Marseille. The port was bustling and busy, and I led my beloved horse Timbuck down the gangway and I bought him some apples. We were kitted out in warm clothing and we said goodbye to our drill tunics and shorts. Northern France was going to be very different to the heat of the desert. Towards the end of October, it was obvious a large attack was being prepared after the Germans nearly broke through our lines. A squadron of Handley Page bombers poured a ton of bombs on the German signals headquarters, and then our firing began in earnest. On the 8th day, the infantry moved forward over the shell-packed ground behind the barrage, but the Germans had moved a fresh division forward to resist. Our men were brought back and the guns ordered to recommence their firing. We gave them another 3 days and nights with gas included. Our infantry moved forward, but again the Germans stood to resist our advance, so our 6-inch howitzers were brought forward under machine gun fire and we blasted them off their positions. By morning our guns had no targets and we moved on until we were 18 miles forward. The enemy was in retreat, so we waited for the end with a sense of satisfaction. On the 11th of November at 11 a.m, everything became quiet. It seemed unreal not to have the sound of guns by day and night. Many of us didn't believe it would last. In the months after the armistice, we went on a mission to salvage some of the costly items expended in our communications setup. It took time for the dead to be collected and buried. And although we were relieved the war had ended, we had a constant reminder of the horrors all around us. How I longed to go home. Eventually, in June 1919, I was told I was to be demobilised. It was a difficult time saying goodbye to my comrades. We'd been together through thick and thin, and we'd seen each other safely through, so parting was hard. We shook hands and said our farewells. I doubted I'd ever see them again. We had plenty of visitors in the weeks following, all there to welcome me home. Many had lost sons and brothers in the war, but were pleased for our family that I'd returned. I heard my great pal Wilkie Wilkinson had been killed. He was such a brave boy. I should have gone to see his 5 sisters, but I couldn't face it. What would I say? How would they react given that I'd survived? I doubted I could have held it together, so I duffed it. The last I heard of my pal Albert Jones was he was in a mental hospital and died there. He was truly the bravest of the 3 of us, and again I should have visited, but I couldn't. The pain was just too great. Many times over the years, especially on Remembrance Day, my grandchildren have asked me why I was crying, and I told them it was about my best friend Timbuck. Writing about him now brings tears to my eyes. I had him for 5 years until my war ended and the day was fixed for me to go home. We'd had many adventures together. We'd slept together at night and he kept me warm. I spent many hours with an arm around his neck talking to him and he always nodded in agreement. But I couldn't leave him to an unknown fate. I'd seen what was happening to the other horses that were no longer needed. Many were being taken for horse meat. I wanted to buy him out, and I thought about this for many nights, but I've got no money. How would I care for him at home? I've no work for him and no income. Nothing to pay for his keep. This was one of the most difficult decisions of my life. I spoke to the farrier. He knew Timbuck well, and he knew our feelings too. After reflection, he said, "Why not shoot him?" I stood there speechless. "You'll know what will have happened to him. It'll be done quickly and kindly. He won't suffer, you know." We'd shot many horses during the war to end their suffering when they were injured in the fighting. But oh dear, was he right? I turned away and I walked into the wood nearby and I cried until I could cry no more. I'd seen men die. I'd seen my comrades dead and injured, but I'd never cried like this. It'd be like shooting my brother, but I couldn't leave him to an unknown fate. The farrier said he'd do it, and I stipulated 1 bullet. I'd seen so many trembling hands and their results. So ended the life of an intelligent, noble animal whose speed at times had been the means of saving me from death. That week was the saddest of my life. I never went to the horse lines again, and I was heartbroken. I'd lost my best friend. His memory remains constant. I've cried over my decision so many times. If only I could have brought him home. If only. I never rode a horse again in my life.
Thank you, Susan.